Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are in this world. God bless you. Today we are in the New Jerusalem Holy Bible, and we are in the book of First Maccabees, and we are in chapter 3. Now I want to show you something about this New Jerusalem Holy Bible. And so you can see, here's the title of chapter 3. And each section has a subtitle. And then there are also written things that sound or read like poems. So I will be reading those as a poem. And the title of chapter 3 is Judas Maccabeus, Leader of the Jews, 166 to 160 BC. Now just remember that the calendar was adjusted after Christ, and it was like renumbered so that it was a countdown in the calendar to Christ. And after that, the numbers started going up again. So here we are in chapter 3, the eulogy of Judas Maccabeus. Chapter 3. His son, Judas, known as Maccabeus, then took his place. All his brothers and all who had attached themselves to his father supported him, and they fought for Israel with a will. He extended the flame of his people. Like a giant, he put on the breastplate and buckled on his war harness. He engaged in battle after battle, protecting the ranks with his sword. He was like a lion in his exploits, like a young lion roaring over its prey. He pursued and tracked down the renegades. He consigned those who troubled his people to the flames. The renegades quailed with the terror he inspired. All evildoers were utterly confounded, and deliverance went forth under his leadership. He brought bitterness to many a king, and rejoicing to Jacob by his deeds. His memory is blessed forever and ever. He went through the towns of Judah, eliminating the irreligious from them, and diverted the retribution from Israel. His name resounded to the ends of the earth. He rallied those who were on the point of perishing. And here's the subtitle for the next section. Initial successes of Judas. Next, Apollonius mustered the Gentiles in a large force from Samaria to make war on Israel. When Judas learned of it, he went out to meet him and routed and killed him. Many fell wounded, and the survivors took to flight. Their spoils were seized, and the sword of Apollonius was taken by Judas, who used it to fight with throughout his life. On hearing that Judas had raised a mixed force of believers and seasoned fighters, Siron, commander of the Syrian troops, said, "I shall make a name for myself and gain honor in the kingdom if I fight Judas and those supporters of his who are so contemptuous of the king's orders." He therefore launched another expedition, with a strong army of unbelievers to support him in taking revenge on the Israelites. He had nearly reached the descent of Beth Horon when Judas went out to confront him with a handful of men. But as soon as these saw the force advancing to meet them, they said to Judas, "How can we few as we are, engage such overwhelming numbers. We are we are exhausted as it is, not having had anything to eat today. It is easy, Judas answered, for a great number to be defeated by a few. Indeed, in the sight of heaven, deliverance, whether by many or by few, is all one. For victory in war does not depend on the size of the fighting force. Heaven accords the strength. They are coming against us in full-blown insolence and lawlessness to destroy us, our wives and our children, and to plunder us. But we are fighting for our lives and our laws, and he will crush them before our eyes. Do not be afraid of them. When he had finished speaking, he made a sudden sally against Siron and his force and overwhelmed them. Judas pursued them down from Beth-Horon as far as the plain. About 800 of their men fell, and the rest took refuge in the country of the Philistines. Judas and his brothers began to be feared, and alarm seized the surrounding peoples. His name even reached the king's ears, and among the nations there was talk of Judas and his battles. Here's a subtitle. Antiochus prepares to invade Persia and Judea, regency of Lysias. The news of these events infuriated Antiochus, and he ordered mobilization of all the forces in his kingdom, a very powerful army. Opening his treasury, he distributed a year's pay to his troops, telling them to be prepared for any eventuality. He then found that the money in his coffers had run short and that the tribute of the province had deceased. As a result of the dissension and disaster brought on the country by his own abrogation of laws that had been in force from antiquity. He began to fear that, as had happened more than once, he would not have enough to cover the expenses and the lavish bounties he had previously been accustomed to make on a larger scale than his predecessors on the throne. In this grave quandary, he resolved to invade Persia, there to levy tribute on the provinces and so accumulate substantial funds. He therefore left Lysias, a nobleman and member of the royal family, to manage the royal affairs between the river Euphrates and the Egyptian frontier, making him responsible for the education of his son Antiochus until he should come back. To him, Antiochus made over half his forces, with the elephants giving him instructions about what he wanted done, particularly with regard to the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem, against whom he was to send a force to crush and destroy the power of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem, to wipe out their very memory from the place, to settle foreigners in all parts of their territory, and to distribute their land into lots. The king took the remaining half of his troops with him and set out for Antioch, the capital of his kingdom. In the year 147, he crossed the river Euphrates and made his way through the upper provinces. And the subtitle, Gorgias and Nicanor, I think it's Nicanor, led the Syrian army into Judea. Lysias, whose Ptolemy, son of Doramenus, with Nicanor and Gorgias, influential men from among the friends of the king, and under their command, dispatched 40,000 foot and 7,000 horse to invade the land of Judah and devastate it, as the king had ordered. The entire force set out and reached the neighborhood of Emmaus in the lowlands, where they pitched camp. The local merchants, hearing the news of this, arrived at the camp, bringing with them a large amount of gold and silver and fetters as well, proposing to buy the Israelites as slaves. They were accompanied by a company from Idumea and the Philistine country. Judas and his brothers saw that the situation was going from bad to worse, and that armies were camping in their territory. They were also well aware that the king had ordered the people's total destruction. So they said to each other, "Let us restore the ruins of our people and fight for our people and our sanctuary." The assembly was summoned to prepare for war, to offer prayer, and to implore compassion and mercy. Here's a poem. Jerusalem was as empty as a desert, none of her children to go in and out. The sanctuary was trodden underfoot. Men of an alien race held the citadel, which had become a lodging for Gentiles. There was no more rejoicing for Jacob. The flute and lyre were mute. Subtitle: The Jews muster at Mizpah. Mizpah. After mustering, they made their way to Mizpah, opposite Jerusalem, since Mizpah was traditionally a place of prayer for Israel. That day they fasted and put on sackcloth, covering their heads with ashes and tearing their garments. For the guidance that the Gentiles would have sought from the images of their false gods, they opened the book of the law. They also brought out the priestly vestments with first fruits and tithes, and marshaled the Nazarites, who had completed the period of their vow. Then, raising their voices to heaven, they cried, "What shall we do with these people, and where are we to take them? Your holy place has been trampled underfoot and defiled. Your priests mourn in their humiliation. And now the Gentiles are in alliance to destroy us. You know what they have in mind for us. How can we stand up and face them if you do not come to our aid?" Then they sounded the trumpets and raised a great shout. Next, Judas appointed leaders for the people to command 1,000, 100, 50, and 10 men. Those who were in the middle of building a house, or were about to be married, or were planting a vineyard, or were afraid, he told them to go home again, as the law allowed. The column then marched off and took up a position south of Emmaus. "Stand to your arms," Judas told them. "Acquit yourselves bravely. In the morning be ready to fight these Gentiles massed against us to destroy us and our sanctuary. Better for us to die in battle than to watch the ruin of our nation and our holy place. Whatever be the will of heaven, he will perform it." Subtitle: The Battle of Emmaus. Gorgias took with him 5,000 foot and 1,000 picked cavalry, and the force moved off by night, with the object of attacking the Jewish position and dealing them with an unexpected blow. The men from the citadel were there to guide him. Judas got wind of it and himself moved off with his fighters to strike at the royal army at Emmaus, while its fighting troops were still dispersed outside the camp. Hence, when Gorgias reached Judas's camp, he found no one, and began looking for the Jews in the mountains. For, he said, "We have got them on the run." First light found Judas in the plain with 3,000 men, although these lacked the armor and swords they would have wished. They could now see the Gentile encampment, with its strong fortifications and cavalry surrounding it. Clearly people who understood warfare. Judas said to his men, "Do not be afraid of their numbers, and do not flinch at their attack. Remember how our ancestors were delivered at the Red Sea when Pharaoh was pursuing them in force. And now let us call on heaven. If he cares for us, he will remember his covenant with our ancestors and will destroy this army confronting us today. Then all the nations will know for certain that there is one who ransoms and saves Israel." The foreigners looked up and, seeing the Jews advancing against them, came out of the camp to join battle. Judas's men sounded the trumpet and engaged them. The Gentiles were defeated and fled towards the plain, and all the stragglers fell by the sword. The pursuit continued as far as Gezer and the plains of Idumea, Azotus, and Jamnia, and the enemy lost about 3,000 men. Breaking off the pursuit, Judas returned with his men and said to the people, "Never mind the booty, for we have another battle ahead of us. Gorgias and his troops are still near us in the mountains. First stand up to our enemies and fight them, and then you can safely collect the booty." The words were hardly out of Judas's mouth when a detachment came into view, peering down from the mountain. Observing that their own troop had been routed and that the camp had been fired, since the smoke which they could see attested the fact. They were panic-stricken at the sight, and when, furthermore, they saw Judah's troop drawn up for battle on the plain, they all fled into Philistine territory. Judas then turned back to plunder the camp, and a large sum of gold and silver, with violet and purple stuffs, and many other valuables were carried off. On their return, the Jews chanted praises to heaven, singing, "He is kind and his love is everlasting." That day had been a remarkable deliverance in Israel. Those of the foreigners who had escaped came and gave Lysias an account of all that had happened. The news shocked and dismayed him, for affairs in Israel had not gone as he intended, and the result was quite the opposite to what the king had ordered. Subtitle: First Campaign of Lysias. The next year he mobilized 60,000 picked troops and 5,000 cavalry with the intention of finishing off the Jews. They advanced into Idumea and made their base at Beth-zor, where Judas met them with 10,000 men. Then he saw their military strength. He offered this prayer: "Blessed are you, Savior of Israel, who shattered the mighty warrior's attack at the hand of your servant David, and delivered the Philistine camp into the hands of Jonathan, son of Saul, and his armor-bearer. Crush this expedition in the same way at the hands of your people Israel. Let their troops and cavalry bring them nothing but shame. Sow panic in their ranks. Confound the confidence they put in their numbers, and send them reeling in defeat. Overthrow them by the sword of those who love you, and all who acknowledge your name will sing your praises. The two forces engaged, and 5,000 men of Lysias's troop fell in one hand-to-hand fighting. Seeing the rout of his army and the courage of Judas's troops, and their readiness to live or die nobly, Lysias withdrew to Antioch, where he recruited mercenaries for a further invasion of Judea and even greater strength. I think I may have read right past chapter 4, and I did. So we are in like the third section of chapter 4, and I'll stop there. And as always, I love you.